Right after God shuts down the spiritual portal at Babel, we have the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. What many people do not know is that Abraham is actually connected to the human project known as the Tower of Babel. But he represents something entirely different. So what is God really doing when he calls Abraham here? How is this story connected to Babel, and what is God really telling Abraham? To understand the deeper truth, we need to break down some key ideas or we're going to miss it. If you want to learn how to read the Bible, you are in the right place. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 says, "Now the Lord said to Abram," which later on his name will be changed to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation." So there are three things that God does here. He says to Abram, he shows Abram later on the land, and he will make of Abram a great nation. Abram is supposed to leave three things: his country, his kindred, and his father's house, to go to this land that God has planned out for him. So to summarize Genesis chapter 12, after Abram leaves his homeland of Babylon in chapter 11, God calls Abram out of Haran to pack up everything and to go to a land Abram has never been to. God promises Abram blessing, a future, a nation, a name, a house, and land. And Abram obeys God but brings Lot with him. Abram stops at two sacred locations to worship God, and then a famine drives Abram and his household to the land of Egypt, where he will deceive the Pharaoh, and then he'll be sent away. Two words to capture Genesis 12, called out. Called out. If we were to summarize this chapter, I would use the phrase called out. Just four words to look for throughout this chapter, nothing really big, but bless or blessing, land, the woman and wife, and then house. So the first thing that we're going to note here in verse 1 is that God tells Abram to go from your country. Now, God has already, up to this point throughout the scriptures, moved people to other locations since the formation of Adam. So in Genesis chapter 2, Adam is the first person God makes and forms outside the garden and then places Adam within the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. In Genesis 3, God sends Adam and Eve away from the tree of life, right? Relocates them after they eat from the forbidden tree of knowledge. In Genesis 4, God sends Cain away east of the garden after he kills Abel, and Cain is sentenced to be a wanderer all his days. And then in Genesis chapter 6, God sends a flood to remove the wicked from the earth, you might say relocate them from off the planet. But he sends Noah into the ark and relocates him and his family into the new world after the flood. So just a few things to pay attention to: how God has relocated and sent people away thus far in the biblical narrative. And in the last chapter, God actually disbanded the Tower of Babel project. If you're familiar with that story, God dispersed them across the face of the land to their respective regions. We have the languages and the tribes and the nations. And now we have God sending Abram, or Abraham later on, he'll be known as. Abram is sent away from Haran to go to the promised land. But in this specific situation, when you contrast it with what happened at Babel, this doesn't seem to be God responding to disobedience like at the other times so far in the biblical story. This seems to be God calling Abram, or Abram, out from among the Chaldeans to set him apart the way that God called Noah in chapter 6. Except Abram here is being led to a different location, okay? And then verse 1, it says that the land Abram is going to is the land that God will, future tense, show Abram, which means Abram has no idea where he's going. So a question I have just about the story is, why did God not tell Abram where he was going? Why not give him a general sense, or at least some kind of direction specifically? In Acts chapter 7, during Stephen's speech, Stephen will mention that God actually appeared to Abram before he lived in Haran. So before Abram finds himself here in Haran, where God calls him out, he was in Ur of the Chaldeans, which seems to be his birthplace, the place of his fathers. And so in the last chapter, they were said to be on their way to the land of Canaan before they settled here in Haran. So I have a question: how did Abram happen to be headed in the right direction where God ultimately planned to bring him, which is the land of Canaan, when God didn't even show him that land yet? So in chapter 11, you have Abram and Terah and their household heading toward Canaan. Terah ends up dying. They settle in Haran. And then now God is pulling Abram away from Haran to go to Canaan. So how did Abram and his family happen to be heading the right direction? There might be a sense of God divinely orchestrating that. Now the Lord said here, just something to pay attention to, God speaking to Abram. God has actually not spoken to a human being since chapter 9. when God gave Noah the sign of the covenant, which was the rainbow. That's significant, though, because that was his last covenant partner that God worked with. And now the next covenant partner, which we're going to have the Abrahamic covenant of circumcision later on, this new covenant partner is from Ur of the Chaldeans. And so there's a separation between chapter 9 and now, which is a gap of God not speaking to an individual directly, but you'll see God speaking to himself or making statements about what's happening in the world. And then God says, go from your country, which is kind of odd because technically Abram is not in his home country. He's already left his homeland, Ur of the Chaldeans, where the Tower of Babel took place in that region. So is this God telling Abram not to go back to his hometown? When it says, go from your country, like don't head back there? Was Abram possibly planning to go back since his father's dead, and he's going to go back to his homeland where Nahor, his other brother, is? Or is this God referring to Haran as his new country? Like, you've settled here long enough. I don't know how long Abram's been in Haran. We don't know any time frame from when Terah died to when Abraham's called. But we do know that there's a possibility of this now becoming the country of Abram. No matter what God is telling Abram to leave both behind. Leave Haran, leave Ur behind, because he's going towards the promised land of Canaan. And so he's leaving behind the northern Mesopotamian region where he was called out of and going towards Canaan, which is away from both those places. This is what it looks like to follow God very often. Each step of obedience God calls us to is forsaking and leaving behind something of our old lives in faith that God has something better for us. And then the mentioning of the Father's house here, it's not just leave your country. It's not just leave your kindred, which is your family. It's leave your Father's house, which seems to be synonymous with the kindred. You go, well, his family is his father's house. Aren't those the same ideas? What is this emphasizing here? And I think the reason that God calls out Abram's kindred and then his father's house is because God wants to do something completely new with Abram that is disconnected from his father, disconnected from their family, disconnected from his father's name. And that's just what I'm guessing. That's what I speculate. And if that is true, then Abram is not to be viewed as a continuation of his father's name and house. But God is in fact doing something new with Abram and setting him apart to start a new story, disconnected from his pagan roots. And this actually makes sense. When God calls us out of darkness, out of our old lives, he's setting us apart from the darkness of our old life and the world we were immersed in, to be the light in this dark world now. And sometimes the story God is writing for each of us involves us being removed from what's familiar, us being removed from what we've so long been associated with and been a part of and found security and identity in, but God has something better for us. And so when God says, I will make of you a great name, moving on to verse 2, this idea of God is the one showing him the land. God is the one commissioning him. God is the one that will bless and make something of Abram. This kind of language is all throughout the scripture, is that God does all the things we cannot, the great things. So when he says, I'll make a great name for Abram, Abram was not, it doesn't seem as though Abram is out trying to make a name for himself. That's not the origin story we get for Abram. It doesn't seem to be he's making something great of himself. He's out to make it a household name and get famous like the Tower of Babel was representing human ambition. Abram was just living his life in Ur when God called him to leave according to Acts chapter 7. And then we contrast this man Abram who's just called and just follows the call of God. Contrast that with the last story of the people coming together in Shinar saying, let's make a name for ourselves. Let's make something great with our hands. Let's ascend to the heavens. Let's get to the divine. And God shuts that down and sends them away to keep them from making a great name of themselves. But with Abram here, God wants to make a great name out of Abram. God sends Abram away in order to make a great name and a house out of Abram. So any greatness that God adds to his people, we see it's for the benefit of others. He says, I will bless you and make your name great so that, key phrase, so that you will be a blessing. So we need to view our lives just like this. Any success, any achievement, any progress, any innovation, any profit, anything good God gives us is not just for us and our benefit and our personal family household benefit, but it's for us to be a blessing somehow to others around us. God does not bless us to the exclusion of others, but he blesses people for the benefit of others. And God is not against making a name of his people and adding greatness to his people, but he wants people to do it his way and with his heart, if that's even what he has in mind for them on this earth. Any degree of influence and fame and name and reputation. So God calls Abram, makes him great, and this is contrasted with the typical human pursuit of greatness and selfish ambition within humanity to make a name out of themselves and make everyone know who they are without God in the picture. And any greatness should be added to us by God. Any greatness, any achievement, anything worth having is added to us by God, not achieved by our own human ambition. So it seems as though God arbitrarily chooses this random guy from Ur. So just the question I have is, why does God seem to arbitrarily choose this random guy from Ur, and then God decides to bless him and make him great so he can be a blessing for no apparent reason? The last partner God worked with was Noah in chapter 6. And we're told that God saw Noah was righteous in his generation. Noah was already walking with God when God called him to build the ark, because Noah's ancestors seem to have a history with God. So it makes sense why God worked with Noah, but with Abram here, Abram doesn't seem to have any family history with God. In fact, as the story progresses, you get more of this picture that Abram and his fathers and their household, they have pagan roots. They have a history of worshiping false gods. They're steeped in paganism and polytheism. So why does God choose this Chaldean out of Ur that has pagan roots and possibly even has a connection to the Tower of Babel and Shinar? It just seems like God is choosing by different criteria here than he did with Noah. In as much as we want to nail down some concrete methodology of God and go, I want to establish some predictable systems by which God always works, unfortunately, God cannot be boxed in. And he doesn't always do what we expect. Now, he is consistent. He is never changing. He is immutable. He is everlasting. He is reliable and faithful in character and in his ways. But he isn't always predictable in his methods and in his strategies and what he does. And then he says, I will make of you a great nation and bless you, and your name will be great, so that you can be a blessing. And it's back to the original calling of humanity in the garden. When God told them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. This is what God tells Noah in chapter 6. God desires for humanity to flourish. God desires for humanity to cultivate and expand and grow and innovate and fill the earth under the guidance of God. Now, this is what God intends to do with Abram, is he's fulfilling what he originally commissioned humanity to do, but now with Abram. And we just saw the table of nations in chapter 10. So if you go 2 chapters back, you'll find the table of 70 nations, 72 nations, I forget how many, and how those nations came to be in Genesis 11 after the Tower of Babel, the languages and all that stuff. But there's one nation that is not going to come from that event at the Tower of Babel. And it's going to be this nation right here that's going to be made out of Abram. God is going to make a new nation out of Abram that will be set apart from and even contrasted with every other nation on the face of the land. In other words, this nation is going to be formed in a unique way, in a special way by God, and it's not going to come from the Tower of Babel. It's a special nation that comes from barrenness and arises by the supernatural power of God. And this nation will stand in stark contrast to every other nation that has already been formed and is already further along. So this nation of Abram is technically not born yet. It's in the works. God's working behind the scenes. It's not even in its infancy yet. Abram has no child. It doesn't exist because there's no descendant from Abraham. So the story is setting us up to view this non-existent nation that God is telling Abram he's going to have, to view that as compared to the other nations that already exist and are much further along by the time God brings this nation into existence at the Exodus. And so it's supposed to feel like, wow, Abram and his nation are really behind every other nation because they are. He doesn't even have a son, while every other nation has multitudes and territory and a language, and that seems to set them up. Abram and his family, they're set up to be a perfect demonstration of the glory and power of God at the Exodus. And so we often feel very behind, just to bring application into this, we feel often very behind when we compare our lives to others. But what God wants to do through us is uniquely different from what he's doing in the lives of others. He's working on a different schedule with each of his people at a different pace in different ways. And when we feel behind, when we feel like we're at a disadvantage or we're slower in our progress, it's often so God gets all the glory for any good that comes from our lives. That's on purpose. That's intentional. And God knows how to make up for any deficiency in us, any lost ground, any lost time. And he even knows how to use that to our advantage for his glory. And later in Scripture, you're going to see the greatness of the nation of Israel will actually become a problem. He says, I will make your name great, and this name continues through the nation. They become a fantastically blessed nation. And because they're so great, that actually becomes a problem for other nations. Like Egypt and Babylon and Moab and Assyria, they will look at Israel and their size and go, wow, Israel's a threat. Israel is something to be afraid of. And so nations will come against God, what God has given a unique status to, which is Israel. And this is what we see with the serpent in Genesis 3. The serpent has a bad eye towards humanity's unique, exalted status among God's creation. And the serpent wants to ruin what God has chosen to exalt. And what this shows us is that God can make much out of little. God can take something insignificant and make it great if he chooses to. God can bring something into existence that has no existence prior to him speaking it into existence. So God's giving Abram a new name, a new house, a new nation, new land, which requires him to leave behind the old. And these four things, the name, the house, the nation, and the land, are four things that are going to be incredibly key components of the rest of Israel's history and of the rest of the scriptures. Throughout the scriptures, these four ideas will be incredibly significant. So pay attention to where you see the name or the house or the land or the nation or even the blessing upon that nation. It's usually incredibly significant. But that's all we got for today. In the next Bible study walkthrough, we will jump into verse 3, where we will continue unpacking what it is that God is really telling Abram here in Genesis chapter 12. So I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Right after God shuts down the spiritual portal at Babel, God calls Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And there are several details you really need to recognize or you'll miss the gold in this passage. For example, Abram does something very odd here. And we have to ask, why does he do this? And there's one specific thing that God tells Abraham that might actually give us a deeper understanding of the gospel. If you want to learn how to read the Bible, you are in the right place. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 12. Genesis 12, starting in verse 3. It says, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So look at all the things that God is doing. God says, I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing because of the fact that God has made his name great. God says, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those, and in your name and lineage all the families of the earth will be blessed. There's a lot of things God does in this passage. But to summarize, Genesis chapter 12, after Abram or Abraham, depending on how you want to refer to him, when he leaves his homeland of Babylon, God ends up calling him out of Haran to pack up everything, to go to a land that Abraham's never been to. And so God promises Abram blessing, a future, a nation, a name, a house, and land. And Abram obeys God, but ends up bringing Lot with him. Abram stops at two sacred locations to worship God, and then a famine drives Abram and his household to the land of Egypt, where he deceives Pharaoh. And then he's sent away. And so if I were to use two words to capture this chapter, I would just use the two words, called out. Abram is called out. Four words to look for: blessing, land, wife or woman, and then house. When God tells Abram in verse 2, back it up a little bit, when he says that I'll make of you a great nation and I will bless you, this is all that God is going to do just per his grace and per his compassion and mercy. He reaches down, finds Abram and goes, I'll bless you. I'll make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Apparently, Abram cannot be a blessing unless his name is first made great. In other words, what it means for Abram's name to be great is that he is a blessing to others. His greatness doesn't terminate on himself. It's not centered around him, but it's actually centered around others. It's others-focused and others-oriented. So Abram is blessed to be a blessing. And God doesn't say Abram is blessed, but he will be blessed. He says, I will bless you. I will make your name great. And once that's his condition, he and his descendants will be able to be a blessing to the rest of the nations. And this is why, just to draw a little application out of this is why God first makes us blessed in Christ through faith. Because we cannot be a true benefit and blessing to others unless we're first blessed ourselves in Christ to be that blessing. So notice the connection between house and blessing and name and nations, all right here jam-packed in this little section of God speaking to Abram. This right here is what spells out the gospel for me. When you look at the house, the nation. In fact, let me just back it up to show you what I mean. Right before God tells Abram what he's going to do with him, he says, Abram, I need you to leave a few things behind. Leave your country, which is why God's going to give him new land. Leave your kindred, which is why God is going to give Abram his own family and nation. Leave your father's house, which is why God is going to give him a new name and make a great name of him. And then he says, go to the land I'll show you. I'll make of you what? A great nation. I'll bless you, make your name great so that you'll be a blessing. So this is about descendants and land and lineage and nation and all that stuff. But I lost my place. Abram is blessed to be the blessing just as we are in Christ. And Galatians chapter 3 verse 8 actually tells us, weirdly enough, and I never understood why, but Galatians 3:8 says that God preached the gospel to Abram when God told Abraham that in you all the nations will be blessed. And so the gospel, seemingly in its most basic form, the good news that God brings is that the Gentiles can be justified by faith alongside the descendants of Abram. It's Jew and Gentile, saved through faith, justification. It's a gift of God's grace. So throughout the biblical story, we've already seen God invite people into his blessing. So when God says, look, I will bless you so you can be a blessing, time and time again, God's already extended that to so many people. He blesses humanity in Genesis 1 and 2. He blesses them again in Genesis 8 when they come out of the ark, Noah and his family in the new world. But people often don't want the blessing of God. People want their own definition of blessing and abundance, and they want it on their own terms and in their own timing. But blessing comes from God alone. True blessing is defined by him alone. And the spiritual condition of blessing and the reality of blessing, it's something that's granted by God alone. It's bestowed. It's not earned, it's not achieved, it's not produced by human efforts, like we see the people at Babel trying to ascend to the place of blessing and favor that only God can grant someone. This is our position in Christ, that God so graciously gives us this free, undeserved gift of being blessed and having this spiritual condition of his favor, just because of the fact that we descend from Abraham spiritually and are grafted into Christ through faith. And in Genesis 3, mankind essentially wanted this, and this is the power grab. Humanity's always overreaching. So they wanted to know good and evil in the garden, just like God. They wanted to be like God. They wanted to be their own gods, and in that sense, they wanted their own name to be made great. Contrasted with God saying, Abram, I am going to make your name great. In Genesis 4, we see that same kind of power grab, where Cain wanted that same favor and acceptance for his own name that Abel had, and he has this jealousy towards Abel. And a great name is not a bad thing, but we have to let God handle our reputation. We have to trust him with our reputation as we just do what he says. And a great name and a great reputation cannot become our ultimate priority and take the place of God as if to be some kind of idol. It cannot come at the expense of obedience to God. It cannot become our greatest pursuit. It must be given by God and not achieved by man. And then verse 3, God says, I will actually bless those who bless you. And then the person who dishonors you, Abram, I will curse. And in you, I think this phrase is key, just like we see that phrase throughout Genesis 6 through 8, with Noah, the people being with Noah. This phrase being in Abraham. All the families of the earth shall be blessed. And we know that blessing is extended in Christ Jesus. So the families and the nations of the earth. I want us to think about this. God made the nations from the Tower of Babel and that event. When he sent them away, he didn't intend to leave them in that condition. He actually intended to work with one chosen, blessed individual, Abram, to bring God's blessing to those nations and to those tribes and tongues across the earth. And this is what God does with Noah. God chose one to be a blessing to those who would be attached to him, right? Noah's the one that you attach yourself to be in the ark with him. And these nations of the earth that come from Noah are going to be blessed through Abram. So in other words, God isn't sending the nations into exile with no hope of return after the Tower of Babel. He's sending them across the land to fulfill this plan of bringing them blessing through this man Abram and his descendants. And this is not God choosing one at the expense of the rest. This is God choosing one for the benefit of the rest, who are in a kind of exile at the moment after being, dispersed across the earth. And when God brings us into the light, he actually intends to send us into the darkness with his blessing, with his love, and to bring others into the light that we now have in Christ. And the whole idea of blessing and cursing is kind of odd, just as it's placed right here in this little speech to Abram. We've seen blessing throughout the story already. We've seen cursing several times already. Genesis chapter 3, God curses the serpent. Then God curses the ground for Adam's sin. Genesis chapter 4, God curses Cain for killing Abel. And with each of these curses, it speaks of their condition and their activity. So the serpent is going to be crushed and brought low. The ground won't produce and will be contrary to Adam. Won't work with him. Cain will be a wanderer. So you notice the activity and the condition that they're in. And then in Genesis chapter 9, Noah will curse his grandson because Noah was violated by his son Ham or Ham. And then Canaan and his line are destined to be of low status and live as servants to the other brothers. And all of that context of cursing should really help us understand what it means for God to curse the enemies of Abraham. And then within this is actually a glimpse into the gospel. Ultimately, Jesus is the true offspring of Abraham who brings God's blessing to the world and the nations. And all of the enemies of Jesus will be crushed along with the serpent that they follow and give their allegiance to. So this is not just talking about Abram's personal enemies or even Israel's national enemies, but it's the spiritual cosmic enemies of God and his son and his people, as well as any physical creature that would come against Jesus, just like we see in Psalms chapter 2. And so we can trust that God will not only extend blessing to the world through our lives, but that at the right time, when God says now is the right time, God will bring the appropriate curse and judgment upon those who have remained against Jesus in rebellion and unbelief. And it's interesting to note that God actually chooses to bless or curse people based on their relationship to Abram. He says, I will bless those who bless you. So for some reason, whether or not someone is blessed or cursed, it depends on their position or proximity or relationship to Abram and his descendants. If they curse, there is enemies. If they bless, there is friends. And this promise is even more true of Christ. I think this is most realized in Jesus. God blesses those who receive his son. This is all over the Gospel of John. And God curses those who reject his son. And we see a glimpse of this in Numbers chapter 22, when the king of Moab tries to curse the nation of Israel, but they're blessed, so Balaam cannot do that, and the king of Moab cannot do that. And it's better than what Israel had. Now that we're in Christ, we have something better. We're not descendants of Abraham physically, like the nation of Israel, but we are spiritual descendants because we're in Jesus. And because he's the blessed one, we remain in that blessed condition for all eternity through our trust in him, which is what makes our condition and our situation a little different than the nation of Israel. And if you go to Deuteronomy 11:26, just to cross-reference the blessing and the curse, God sets a blessing and a curse before the people of Israel. And he says if they follow his laws, they'll be blessed. If they disobey his laws, they will be or come under the curse. And what we see is that Jesus ultimately will have to come and be the perfect blessed human we all failed to be, so that he can graciously take our curse upon himself on the tree in order that we might become blessed children of God and friends of Jesus through his atonement. In other words, the blessing God intends to extend through Abraham and his descendant, Jesus namely, that has to come by Jesus first taking our curse to replace that curse with blessing. The same idea is in Numbers 22, when God turns the curse into a blessing. That's what he does with his son. And that's what he promises to do with Abram and his descendants. And then the families of the earth are in mind here, which is kind of odd. Right now, the nations of the world are divided after the Tower of Babel. They're separated by language and culture and religion and land. But God finds Abram when the last story is the dividing of the world. And what God plans to do with Abram is use Abram and his descendants, namely Jesus, to unite the world once again under God and under Jesus as the king over all the nations. So he brings true godly unity, God does, but God sets that plan into motion to bring us all back into the garden by choosing this one guy named Abram from Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram is supposed to be viewed as like another Adam, but now it's in a new and different world. Humanity is in a different condition than when God first made Adam and Eve. And so verse 4, we have Abraham going. He obeys. Abram went as the Lord had told him. And we have this interesting detail, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So just a few questions about Abram leaving. What did it even mean for Abram to just pick up everything and leave with all of his possessions and family, at least his household? How long had he stayed in Haran before God actually told him to leave? How long did he wait for a word from God? What did he actually expect God was going to do? These are questions that I have. And the reason I ask these things is because this is often what it looks like for obedience in our lives. When we obey God, it'll often look in similar ways to this. We aren't even sure of the next destination sometimes, but God has told us just the next step to take. We don't have all the details. We don't know how it'll work out, but we know he's commanded us to move. And we know that he's told us to listen to his voice. And so faith-filled obedience does not require all the details. We just need to know that God said to do it. And then this interesting detail about Lot going with him. I just want to pause and ask, why are we told specifically that Lot went with him? Obviously, Lot is with him at this point in the story. We know that because of the last chapter. So it seems like unnecessary extra statement about Lot, like just repetitive. But also, Abram was just told to leave his kindred, his father's house, and the country, and that seems to include Lot. If it's assumed that Abram was supposed to take Lot and his wife with him, then I don't know if this extra statement would have needed to be added. This detail sticks out to me as being out of the ordinary, unexpected, and possibly even like a but kind of clause, which notes that, maybe Abram only partially obeyed rather than completely obeying God. In other words, this one small statement that Lot went with him, that will become an incredible issue throughout the rest of the story of Abram and even the rest of the biblical story. When the narrative unfolds, it seems very clear by the time you get just a few chapters in that you're like, I don't believe Abram was supposed to take Lot and his wife. Now you can consider it like an act of charity and love. Well, Lot doesn't have a father, and his father died, Haran, and he has nowhere to go. He could go back to his homeland, but we can defend it all we want. But the idea is, I'm convinced, per the story and where it's going, that Abram was not supposed to take Lot and his wife. And whether or not that's an appropriate conclusion to make, there is application and wisdom in the scriptures that we need to learn how to obey God fully. Not partially, not half-heartedly, not in the areas where we're comfortable, and fully in all things. If it's partial obedience, it's disobedience, like straight up. Half obedience to God leaves an open door for the enemy in our lives, which can end up making our lives much harder than God actually intended for it to be. And then we're told that Abram is 75 when he leaves Haran, which technically is the second place we've seen Abram. He left Ur, now he's in Haran, and he's headed toward Canaan or Canaan. So why are we told how old Abram is when he leaves Haran, but not how old he is when he left Ur? We're not told how old he is when his father died. We're not told how old he is when Lot was born. None of those are reference points for Abram's life. We have no previous time markers for Abram's life until now. And I think what the narrative is implying is that this is the very moment where everything changes for Abram. His new life and his story officially begins now, with God kind of writing this new chapter in the scriptures. Everything up till now seems to be viewed as just a kind of old life. all the preparation, all the things being put in place. Kind of like how Moses is called at 80 years old, being a shepherd out there and with Jethro in Midian, and God calls him from the flaming bush, and we're like, wow, he's 80. Why does God call him now? I think this is a very similar moment where God works with each different person on his own different time frame. And there's a different clock and a different, set of expectations with each person's life that God works with. So we're going to jump into verse 5 in the next Bible study, walk through. That will be a fun one because of where Abram actually ends up. It's very fascinating, the stops that he makes along the way to Canaan and why he ends up there and what he's doing. So I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts, your comments in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next Bible study walkthrough. Right after God shuts down the spiritual gateway at Babel, we have the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And what's very interesting is that Abram ends up going to a place that seems very reminiscent of the Tower of Babel. See, Abram finds himself in two sacred spiritual locations on the earth, and they seem to function as a sort of spiritual bridge. But these two places are very different from the Tower of Babel. So why are we told what Abraham does specifically at these two places? And how does this give us a glimpse of the future? If you want to learn how to read the Bible, you are in the right place. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 12. Well, let's start in verse 6. Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oaks of Moreh. Actually, back it up to verse 5. Abram ends up taking Sarah and Lot, and they leave from Haran, and they take all their possessions, the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oaks at Moreh. At the time, the Canaanites were actually in the land. So to summarize chapter 12 of Genesis, Abram leaves his homeland of Babylon. God calls Abram out of Haran to pack up everything to go to a land Abram's never, ever been to. God promises Abram that he'll be a blessing, that he has a future, a nation, a name, and a house and land waiting for him. And Abram obeys God, but brings Lot with him. Abram ends up stopping at two sacred locations to worship God along the way, and then a famine will end up driving Abram and his family to the land of Egypt, where Abram will end up deceiving the Pharaoh and then be sent away. So starting in chapter 5, Abram ends up taking Sarah, if I can find the place, taking Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, just so you are, I guess, reminded of who Lot is. And this is similar to what was said in the last chapter with Terah, Abram's father. Terah took Abram, Sarah, Lot, his wife, and they went to Haran. And they ended up leaving Nahor, who is Abram's brother, behind in the land of Ur. And this idea of taking, Abram here, taking Sarah and taking Lot, throughout the biblical story, it can just mean that Abram brought, Sarah and Lot with him. But a lot of times throughout the biblical story, it can imply reaching beyond one's own God-given authority, overreaching to do what God has not approved of. And you can reference Genesis 3, Genesis 4, Genesis 6, Genesis 9 for instances of that. What is fascinating to me, and might bother some people, is that we have here the possessions that Abram has acquired, and he's acquired some people while living in Haran. Okay, and this is another detail that becomes so very important to the rest of Abram's story and the rest of the entire Bible. Abram will have an Egyptian servant that we'll know as Hagar, and it seems likely that he had acquired Hagar in Haran, where God is calling him out of. So just a question I have is, how did Lot and Abram acquire people? Was this something God approved of? Likely no. Was this something that God frowned upon? Likely yes. Even if you chalk this up to just a cultural norm, I don't believe God approves of people owning other people. And considering the role that Hagar will play and the trouble that will surround this poor woman, it doesn't seem as though God approves of it. But nothing is clearly stated here necessarily. It doesn't say, and God disapproved and God frowned upon. But the rest of Scripture shows us that God is against possessing and owning other humans, as if they're to be objects for our own benefit and use. But for now, we do get a glimpse into that culture and the people that God is working with. So this just goes to show that because people get away with things, or because we get away with things at times, and for a period of time, that doesn't mean that God approves of what we've done or what others have done. Eventually, it will catch up with us, and there are consequences in God's timing, as we'll see with the Egyptian servant Hagar and what happens with her. So, what does this tell us about the location of Haran? Seeing as how Abram and Lot are acquiring people there, does this actually give us a glimpse into that society and that environment? Because up to this point, we've heard nothing about Abram and Lot acquiring people in Ur of the Chaldeans, but it could be that just wasn't recorded for sure. We just can't say whether or not they acquired people before this, or whether this is a new thing, but if the scriptures only tell us now, it might be indicating something about the place of Haran, or where Abram and Lot are mentally at and morally at. So the statement about acquiring people in Haran is comparable to when it says that Abram took Lot. Both of these become two bigger issues later on. So if you go back, Abram ends up taking Lot. Chapter 4, or verse 4 rather, it says that Lot went with Abram. So these two instances of Abram acquiring people and Lot going with him will become two big problems throughout the rest of Abraham's story. So they end up going to Canaan, the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abraham's going to pass through there. But the author tells us that they're going to Canaan or Canaan. And so because he's recording this data in hindsight, it doesn't seem likely that Abram knew where he was going, just that the author is referring to the land of Canaan as where Abram's going. He just had a general sense of direction, and this is what it looks like and how it feels often to follow God. We have a general sense of direction, a general sense of where we're going, and at least the next step, but God withholds many details to keep us dependent upon Him the whole time. And by doing so, this keeps us from growing arrogant and self-reliant. So I'm not sure that Abram knew exactly where he was going or the destination, just that the author, in hindsight, knows where Abram is going to end up and where he's heading at this moment in the story. And it says that he passes through the land. When he set out to go to the land, they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through this land. So we're supposed to think, promised land. Why are you passing through, buddy? To go to the place at Shechem, to the oak at Moreh. So something to highlight about this, so far there's no indication that Abram knows the significance of the land of Canaan. He might not even be aware of what he's exactly passing through, which will be the promised land later for his descendants. The fact that he's moving on to another place, going through the promised land, might indicate that he doesn't realize the significance of where he's at, because God might not have told him quite yet the significance of the land of Canaan, just that God's going to give him land and a name and a house. And then we have Shechem, and we have the oak of Moreh. And these two places are called out because they'll be incredibly significant for Abram's story, as well as Isaac and Jacob. And these become sacred spaces where the patriarchs will frequently meet with God, or God will meet with them, and then they'll offer sacrifices. They'll call upon God's name. And this does not mean they have any significance at this point in the story where Abram is, but they become famous locations, very well-known places. So these are times, there are times and places in our lives that become incredibly significant to us because of how God met us in that season or met us in that place and space. And God is not restricted to any space. Now that we're filled with the Spirit, new covenant believers, born again through our faith, but God does seem to work in unique and amplified ways at certain times and in certain spaces throughout our life and in seasons. So just to note here, God is going to appear to Abram here. That's why I'm putting all this up front before we jump into this moment where Abram offers sacrifice and stuff. But God's going to meet Abram here. God decides how and when he meets with us in ways that will mark us for the rest of our lives. And so we have to learn how to be open to God meeting us in any space and in any season of life, because he can turn any location into sacred space, just like this common oak here at Moreh will be turned into at Shechem. God can turn any season into sacred time that becomes a landmark that we reference for the rest of our lives. And then we're told this odd detail about the Canaanites here being in the land. So notice the flow of the narrative. Abram is called out, he leaves, he acquires people and possessions. Abram's passing through the land, he goes to Shechem, finds himself at the oak of Moreh, and then we're told this interesting detail that seems completely out of place. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. So I just have a question. Why are we given this passing statement about the Canaanites? Is this just to let us know the setting and set up the story for us? Or is this fact possibly connected to what Abram does and why he does it here at the oak at Moreh, or why he passes through the land? Here's what I'll say. It seems very likely that Abram passes through the land of the Canaanites to find himself at the Oak of Moreh because of the fact the Canaanites occupy the land currently. So possibly he's found this oak to be a place of safety in the midst of that pagan darkness he's surrounded by. So this place in time for Abram might function for him the way the ark did for Noah. This sacred space where God meets with man to preserve and protect them from the chaos that surrounds them. So this is what God promises to be to his people. And this is why God appears to Abram, I believe, in this place. Because God promises to be a shelter for us in the midst of chaos, in the midst of the storm. Not always away from the chaos and the storm, but often in the midst of it. And so God is our sanctuary at all times, in all places and spaces. He's our safe place, and we need to learn how to run to him, how to confide in him in every environment and in every season of life. So the fact that they were in the land from the vantage point of the author means it was past tense. He's speaking of that as a past tense idea. So what we see here is from the vantage point of the author recording this, it doesn't seem as though the Canaanites are actually in the land when he's recording this story. Rather, during Abram's lifetime, the Canaanites are in the land. But it doesn't seem to be so when the author records this from his vantage point. And this gives us an idea, possibly, of how and when Genesis was recorded and assembled. And then verse 7 says, "Then the Lord appeared to Abram," or Abraham, his name will be changed to later. And this is what the Lord says at the Oak of Moreh to Abram in the midst of the Canaanites and the land that he's going to occupy later. God says, "To your offspring I will give this land." So notice the emphasis on the land. Right now the Canaanites occupy that land. But God is promising, "I'm going to give your descendants this land." So Abram builds an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. I love that God appears, but how did God appear? In what form? Was this in a vision? Was this in a visible form? And has God appeared to Abram since he called him out of Haran? If not, the question that I have is, why has God waited until now to meet with Abram in this place at Shechem? We don't decide, nor does Abram decide, when God appears in big ways. But we can be ready, and we can make the necessary preparations to be open to his presence wherever he chooses to meet us in big ways. And then God promises, "This is the land I'm going to give to your offspring." A few verses ago, God said he would show Abram the land that he's taking him to, and now God has appeared to do exactly that. He's letting Abram know, this is the place. So I just wonder how much wandering took place before Abram finally ended up here in the land of the Canaanites and at the Oak of Moreh. How long did he wander? How much time has passed since he left Haran? We don't have all that recorded, but this promised land will become the place where God brings Israel into after they wander for 40 years in the desert. And they don't earn it, they don't achieve it, but God gives it. So anything worth having is given by God as a gracious gift, just as Abram and his descendants will receive. It doesn't mean that we will never co-labor with God in doing things and producing things, but all that we have in Jesus that God promised to Abraham's descendants, all of that is a free gift of God's grace, a free gift of God's generosity. And then notice this, you would expect God to say, "To you, I'm going to give this land," but he goes, "To your offspring, I will give this land." Now, from our vantage point, we might think that's pretty discouraging. It's not exactly what Abram wants to hear. But even though I'll say it like this, it doesn't mean that it's not for Abram. But it won't be given and distributed during the lifetime of Abram. The focus is on his descendants. The focus is on the land. Abram benefits, but his descendants will be the ones who realize the promise when they occupy the land several centuries later. And so this is what it means for Jesus to be the true heir of Abram. He realizes all the promises of God for Abram. He secures the spiritual land of promise in an even greater way than the promised land was given to Israel. So the security and the assurance that we have in Jesus far outweighs any sense of security that Israel had in their physical land. It far outweighs what it is that God intends to do with the physical land, everything that we have now in Jesus. Verse 7, it says, he built an altar. That's how Abram here responds to God's just gift of generosity. He builds an altar. So what prompted Abram to build an altar at the Oak of Moreh? Can we presume that he offered sacrifices on the altar? Or was it just a representation of Abraham's heart toward God, which was a heart posture of humility and sacrifice and thankfulness? And then how did Abram know to respond like this to the extravagant grace and promises of God? What prompted that? How did he know that? What awareness did he have? What's interesting is that God has not officially done anything quite yet, except appear to Abram, give him a promise, and this word was enough for Abram to build an altar in gratitude. There's been no activity from God, just a promise. If you want to count God appearing as the activity, sure, and God calling, sure. But Abram's altar is a response to God appearing and speaking, which tells me that God's very presence demands worship because he is so worthy. And we see this with many characters in the Bible. When they're given a glimpse of God, they fall down and worship at his feet. And sometimes we focus so much on the activity of God in our life that we forget how precious his promises are and how sure his word is. We forget how awesome his very near presence is. What should always prompt worship and thanksgiving in our hearts is not just the fact that God is doing things in our lives, but it's the very guarantee of his word and his promises in Christ. So we technically always have a reason to worship because of what he has said and because of who he is and because of his constant presence in our lives. And so just as we saw with Noah, the focus is on God's interaction with one specific human partner. See, in Noah's story, it's easy to lose sight of all the people in the background who benefit from Noah's faithfulness. His sons, their wives, Noah's wife. And here, as Abraham is said to be doing all of these things, it's so easy to lose sight of the fact that there's a wife present. Abram's nephew Lot and his wife are present. They have servants, they have a household, they have animals, they have possessions. And Abram's faithfulness here seems to benefit all those who are with him, just like Noah. Just as the emphasis in Noah's story was on, hey, Noah and those who are with Noah. And the fact that Abram builds an altar just brings me back to Noah's story again. The last altar that we saw built was by Noah, when Noah sacrificed to God after the flood, and God said in his heart that he would never destroy the land by flood again. And God makes a covenant, which seems to be in response to Noah's sacrifice, right? But here we see that same dimension of God making a promise, but Abraham's sacrifice is a response rather than the motivation of the covenant. So no matter what, it's God's grace that motivates the covenant, but it seems as though God was responding to Noah's sacrifice there when he made the covenant. And here, Abram's sacrifice comes after God makes these promises. And our only response to the beautiful covenant God has made with us because of Jesus is that we would live as a sacrifice unto him, just as Romans 12 says. Jesus already made the sacrifice that initiated and sealed this covenant. So now we get to be a daily sacrifice for God's glory out of our love for God and thankfulness for what he's done. And the fact that God appears to Abram, this is not the only time that God will appear to Abram. Each time is very, very sacred. God will appear again to Abram in Genesis 15 to make the covenant with Abram and warn him of the slavery that his people will endure for 400 years. God will appear to Abram in Genesis 17, where he reaffirms his promises and gives Abram the covenant of circumcision. And then in Genesis 18, God appears to Abram to promise him that a son is coming the following year. And then he'll warn him of the judgment that's coming on Sodom and Gomorrah, because Abram's nephew, Lot, lives in that region, and God is warning him. So these will be the only 4 times that God, in Scripture at least, explicitly appears to Abram. And each time it involves promise and a glimpse into the future. I want us to think about this. The 4 times God appears to Abram involves a promise and a glimpse into the future. And that's something that's very sacred. So just something to consider when we think about the reason God appears to Abram and his descendants. Not to make any absolute application from this, but at times, God does meet with us in very unexpected places and situations and seasons of life. God meets us in the most unexpected of times, and then God gives us, at times, sometimes he gives us a glimpse of our future and reminds us of the general future that awaits for all the children of God. In other words, God reminds us of his word and promises in order to encourage us. And sometimes that includes a glimpse of what he has for us personally on the earth, and a glimpse into our personal future to just keep us going. And then verse 8, from there Abram moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent. Pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he builds another altar to the Lord. And this time he calls upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. So what's interesting here is that we're told the place in the hill country Abram sets up shop is going to be to the east of Bethel, and on the west we'll have Ai. Sorry, I mixed it up. Bethel's on the west, Ai's on the east. So why are these two places the reference points for where Abram is? Why are these two locations the landmarks? Because Bethel will be a very significant place throughout the biblical narrative that will become a very sacred place where God meets with people, especially Jacob and the dream that he has. So think about, I think it's Genesis chapter 31 as the place where God meets Jacob in a dream. God refers to himself as the God of Bethel later on to Jacob. And so God identifies himself with that place for Jacob, which means Bethel becomes a very sacred place. It becomes a place where the nation of Israel comes to meet with God throughout Judges and throughout Samuel the prophet's days. And then Ai here, if you're not familiar with Ai, just think Joshua and all the places God led Joshua and the people of Israel through. Ai will be the second Canaanite city that Joshua and the Israelites take down after Jericho. So we have to ask, why are these places significant? What are these places associated with? And then how might all of that understanding inform the way we understand what's happening here with Abram in this place and in this moment of time? And is there any connection between these stories? And then Abram does what he did in the last place, which is he builds another altar. In this nameless hill country, Abram builds an altar to God again, and he calls upon the name of the Lord God. The question I have is why? This is the second stop Abram has made, and at both stops, he seems to dedicate both locations to God by calling on him and sacrificing to God. It's as if Abram needs God to meet with him in whatever space and location he finds himself in, and this is so true for us. We need God to meet us wherever we're at. We need to be open to the presence of God invading our space and reality at any moment in whatever way God wants to interact with us. And when God so clearly meets with us, that space and that moment in time becomes sacred and dedicated to him and his kingdom. But the question becomes, are we building altars with our lives and in our bodies and everything God has given us? Are we building altars along the journey that God has us on? In other words, do we intentionally make space and set apart time to meet with God and dedicate ourselves to him and his kingdom? And then the fact that Abram calls upon the name of the Lord, when we see Abram at the oak of Moreh building an altar, we don't see that language. We're not explicitly told that he called upon the name of the Lord, so why are we told here that he calls upon the name of the Lord, but not at the last place? And is this to note something different here in the hill country? And if so, what is that, and why is it being stated? We've not seen this language since Genesis chapter 4, actually, when the generation of Enosh is said to be calling upon the name of the Lord. And if that's the last time we saw someone do this, what does that tell us about Abram? What does that tell us about this special chosen one, the patriarch of the faith, Abraham? And then Abraham will journey on toward the Negeb. And it just seems as though Abram has no idea where he's going. There's a general sense of direction. There's a general sense of what step is the next step to take. But he doesn't know the destination, or even if there is one. What we know is that Abram will live the rest of his life as a wandering nomad in the promised land. He will never settle permanently. He will never get to a place where he can permanently build a home for the rest of his life and put down roots. He's always on the move. And because he's in a foreign land, that means he's a wanderer. And because danger is on every side with no sense of security and stability that comes from putting down roots, Abram needs to look to God every step along the way as much as possible. And this should be our response to whatever life throws at us and wherever we find ourselves. Abram's not only dedicating these spaces and times to God, but he's desperate for God to get involved. And we have to have that same sense of desperation for God to meet us and be a part of every space and every place we find ourselves in. So let us be aware of how much we need God in every moment, and let's look to him and call upon his name as much as possible, because it is in our best interest to do so. We'll pick it up in Genesis 12, verse 10, and we will close this chapter in the next Bible study walkthrough. So I'll see you guys in that next video, and in the meantime, let me know your thoughts and comments in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Right after God shuts down the spiritual gateway at Babel, we have the call of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And somehow Abram finds himself in Egypt after a famine strikes the land. But if you pay close attention, this story is bridging two significant biblical events together. Not only is there a glimpse into the future here, but there's a callback to the past. And when you see it, this small story will blow your mind. So what's really happening when Abram goes down to Egypt? Why does he feel like he needs to trick Pharaoh? If you want to learn how to read the Bible, you are in the right place. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 12. Genesis 12:10 says, "Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land." This is the last official teaching here on Genesis 12. To summarize, after Abram leaves his homeland of Babylon, God calls him out of Haran. God promises to give him a legacy and a name and all that. And Abram ends up stopping along two specific locations to worship God, and then a famine drives him to Egypt. Two words to capture Genesis 12 would be called out. Abram is called out. The famine in the land here is a huge... There are two stories that come to mind, and when you see how they connect here, this story is bridging two key biblical events together. It'll blow your mind. The way that it blew my mind, I think. In Genesis 26, verse 1, just to give you a little glimpse into the future, Abram will have a son named Isaac, okay? And Isaac will have to endure a famine in his lifetime, which causes him to have to move to the land of the Philistines, if you're familiar with the Philistines. The author will tell us the last famine was in the days of Abraham, looking backward in hindsight. So you're supposed to see a comparison being drawn between Abram and Isaac and both the famines they endure and how Egypt is a part of both their stories. Then God actually appears to Isaac in the midst of that famine and says, hey, don't go down to Egypt. So we have God appearing, the patriarch moving, the famine happening, and then a promise of blessing and abundance, just as we have right here in verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 10 and 11. Because right before this event of Abram leaving the land to go to Egypt, God just showed up and gave him a promise about the land and his descendants. But here Abram goes down to Egypt. So a question I have is, was Abram supposed to respond like this? Was he supposed to go to Egypt? Did God tell Abram to do this and we don't have it recorded? Or did Abram actually move out of fear and react to his environment in his own human wisdom without consulting God? If we consider what God does with Isaac in Genesis 26, in this exact situation, we might be able to conclude that God actually did not want Abram going down to Egypt. Though the text doesn't tell us that explicitly, we might be able to draw that conclusion. And this could be a different situation, but it just seems unlikely when I read the story. Whether or not Abram fell out of the will of God here, we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful that we don't begin to move out of fear and make decisions out of pure self-preservation. We have to make sure that we consult God in all things rather than purely reacting to our environment and our circumstances. And prayer is how we discern the right move to make in any given situation. Sometimes what seems to offer us the most safety and the most protection will actually lead us into more problems that God wanted to spare us from. Fear of lack cannot move us. And any kind of fear cannot be the driving voice of our life. And the fact that he goes down to Egypt, of all the places, why did Abram choose to go down to Egypt? What did he know about Egypt? Did he have any history with Egypt or knowledge of that country? Did Egypt have a reputation? Or did he just have a general direction and he found himself in Egypt? Throughout the Bible, I want us to consider that there will be this repeating theme of people either going down to Egypt or desiring to go back to Egypt. We'll see Joseph in Genesis. He'll go down to Egypt. He'll be taken to Egypt, and he'll be there during another famine that will hit the land of Canaan. And then Joseph's family, Jacob is his father, his family will come down to him at Egypt to escape the famine. And we already saw how in Genesis 26, Isaac is essentially tempted to do the same, except God warns him. And in Exodus and Numbers, the people of Israel will experience a kind of hunger and a lack that drives them to want to go back to Egypt for the food that was there. In 2 Kings chapter 25, the people of Judah will try and escape from King Nebuchadnezzar and the judgment that's coming through him, and they'll seek refuge in Egypt under Pharaoh's wing. Hosea actually speaks about how foolish Israel is for running to Egypt in times of terror when Nebuchadnezzar's coming as well, or rather Assyria, seeking protection from Egypt or in Egypt. And then in Matthew chapter 2, we have the toddler Jesus escaping King Herod because, well, his parents decide to bring him to Egypt, which fulfills prophecy. So there's this theme throughout the Bible of people running to Egypt, and in every case, except with Jesus, it seems to be a negative thing. Either it's a decision made out of fear or blatant disobedience to God, but every time except with Jesus in Matthew 2, it seems to note a lack of trust in God. So that may likely be what's happening here with Abram when he goes down to Egypt to escape the famine. Interestingly enough, Abram will end up having an Egyptian servant whom he acquired somehow, likely in Haran, possibly here, and she and her offspring, Hagar, will become a huge part of the story. And then there is a famine here. We gotta address the elephant in the room. We're all wondering, why did God call Abram to a place where God knew there'd be a famine? Why did God allow a famine to happen to his chosen covenant partner? We would expect God to protect Abram and to keep him from such bad circumstances, but God seemed to lead Abram right into it. And sometimes God will lead his people around the chaos and trouble, and we get to avoid it. And at other times, he asks us to follow him right into the valley of the shadow of death and to trust him. And we need to learn how to discern in each situation what God is actually asking of us to do. It won't always be the same all across the board, but being chosen by God does not mean that we're exempt from trouble. It actually means we have God's favor and we have his presence in the midst of it. Now, after going down to Egypt, look at what Abram does, or look at what he says, rather, to his wife and half-sister Sarah, or Sarai. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, "Look, I know that you're a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they're going to say, 'This is his wife,' and then they're going to try and kill me. But they'll let you live. So, can you do me a favor? Say that you're my sister, so that it goes well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful, just like Abram anticipated. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. So exactly what Abram expected them to do. Abram is at least 75. Let's think about this for a second. Abram is 75 at least, and his wife is 10 years younger. But she ain't super young. So how beautiful was this woman, who was probably pushing 70, that Abram knew the Egyptians would really want her? And what does this reveal about Abram? That he's scheming up a plan based on his assumption that the Egyptians will want to take his wife. And why is the story highlighting this moment in Abram's life and the conversation that takes place between him and Sarah? I think there's something deeper happening in this conversation we're supposed to see. And then verse 12, when it says, the Egyptians might see you and they'll say, "This is his wife. Let's kill him and we can just have his wife." I just have a question, like, what experiences previously has Abram already had with Egypt? Like, what did he hear or know about them? What was their reputation? How did he know they would react this way? The way that they did to want Sarah's beauty. Was this just a general knowledge of mankind? And Abram's like, people are pretty wicked. Or did Abram have some history with the Egyptians already? We know he has an Egyptian servant named Hagar at some point. So maybe that gives us a better idea. And then there's this fear of dying. We don't know if the Egyptians would have ever done this, or if this was just an irrational fear of Abram. They did take her, they did want her, so maybe he was right about the fact that they would have killed him too. But either way, we have to be careful not to let hypothetical scenarios and assumptions drive our decisions. We have to be extra careful as believers that we don't make decisions based on irrational fears that are likely to never even happen. So, whatever the case, we need to be careful not to assume, and actually we need to consult God first so that we don't get into trouble. We don't see Abram here consulting God at all. He actually, what did I write in my notes? We don't see Abram consulting God here at all, or even building an altar to bring God into this situation like we saw at the last two places. We see Abram scheming on his own and using his wife as a shield for himself. He knows that he can use his wife to preserve his own life and guarantee his own safety. And this is actually a very real temptation for many of us. The temptation is to use and view other people as a means to guarantee our own safety and preserve our own selves, even if it's at a cost to them. And this is just not what God desires of us. He wants us to trust that He's got our back and that we don't need to use other people as body shields like Abram ends up doing here with his own wife and half-sister Sarah. Real quick, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you at abovereproachministry.com. Go to the website or click the links in the description below to check out all of our free Bible study resources. We have online Bible classes, devotional studies, Bible study workshops, all of my sermon notes, and more. You can even join our online church community on the Discord app. We also have discussion groups all around the world, and if you don't see one in your area, message me and we'll help you start a launch group. I personally lead a group in Spartanburg, South Carolina. If you live in the area, we'd love to have you join us on Fridays for Bible study. So contact me if you're interested, and if you or your church would like me to come preach or teach, just message me or shoot me an email and we'll see what we can do, because I love preaching in person. If you're a new follower of Jesus, click the New Believers section to access everything we recommend for new believers. And be sure to snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, to support this ministry. All right, that's all I got for you. Let's jump back into the video. And then verse 13, things become eerily reminiscent of a previous story we've seen. Verse 13 says, I want you to say this, okay, Sarah, listen to me. When we get to the Egyptians, tell them you're my sister, so that it goes well with me because of you. Like, if they like you, that'll fall onto me, and my life will be spared for your sake. This is technically true that Sarah's his sister, but it's not the complete truth. Abram's using a half-truth to cover his own butt, and he's convincing his wife to participate in his scheme. He knows that he can ride on the coattails of her beauty to be treated well by the Egyptians. In other words, her favor will be extended to Abram, and Abram doesn't yet trust God the way he will later on. His relationship with God is still very much in its infancy, and it's developing. Abram, by no stretch of the imagination, is perfect, especially if we see decisions like this. Yet God still chooses to work with this man, knowing full well the mistakes Abram's going to make. And yet Abram is still not disqualified. And when God chooses us to be His children, He knows exactly what He's getting Himself into. He knows that we'll fail along the way, but He still chooses to graciously work with us and use us anyway. Verse 15 says, And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. I'm going to come back to something I want to reference in Genesis chapter 3. But for now, the fact that the woman is taken. If Abram knew the kind of people that were in Egypt, why the heck did he go down there and let them take his wife? How was he okay with his wife being taken by another man into his house? Verse 16 says, And for her sake, guess what? Pharaoh actually ended up giving favor to Abram and dealt well with him. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, camels, all the stuff that is valuable he gives to Abram because of Sarah. So just like Abram predicted, Pharaoh dealt well with him by preserving his life, for sure. He didn't kill him, but not only that, I think Abram didn't anticipate that Pharaoh would give him lots of stuff. So I just have a question. Why would Pharaoh give lots of gifts to Abram just for being the brother of this beautiful woman? Was this a kind of transaction taking place and a payment being made to Abram? Or is this like the gifts that we see Abram's servant? Later on, Abram's going to send his servant to his brother's house to find a wife for his son Isaac. And then Abram's servant is going to bring gifts to Rebekah and her brother and her mother as a kind gesture. Is that what's happening here? Or is this like a bride price kind of deal? Verse 17, right after the gifts we see and the kindness Pharaoh shows to Abram, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. So we have great plagues, we have Pharaoh, we have Egypt, and we have one of God's chosen messengers. Interesting. What does that sound like? So just looking at this, it's because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Now we already know Sarah's Abram's wife. Why tell us all these different times? And what did the Lord exactly do to Pharaoh and his house? What were these great plagues? How long was this going on before Pharaoh realized, I think we made a mistake. I think there's a divine hand behind this. And what convinced Pharaoh that there was a God behind this? How did he come to know that Sarah was actually Abram's husband? How many plagues took place? All these different questions that we can't answer, but it just makes you think a little. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me?" He called Abram and says, What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Look, here's your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him. What did he order the men to do? Not sure. And they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Possibly the order is, hey, send Abram and his wife away. But let's backtrack a little bit. There are a few details we really need to break down. In verse 18, when Pharaoh goes, "What have you done to me?" That's very reminiscent of what God said to the serpent. "What have you done?" Or to Adam, "What have you done?" Or to Cain, "What have you done?" Your brother's blood cries out from the ground. Or what Noah told Ham, when Noah realized what Ham did to him. There's this "what have you done" kind of situation that takes place. So this story right here fits perfectly into the template that we see in Genesis 3, which becomes recycled over and over throughout the stories. And then I want to think about how this story foreshadows the Exodus narrative. Okay, so we have the king of Egypt here, Pharaoh. We have Pharaoh taking a bride that technically belongs to someone else. We have great plagues that come on Egypt, whatever those were. And we have God doing these things on behalf of this wife or bride that belongs to Abram, because a wife was taken or a bride was taken. We have someone scheming to use another human for their own benefit, Abram, going, "Sarah, listen to what I'm saying. Let's do this." Abram schemes this whole thing up like Pharaoh does in Exodus when he abuses the Israelites, and he schemes a plan to kind of oppress them and keep them weak and use them for his own labor force. And then we have Abram and Sarah being sent out strongly by Pharaoh at the end, just as we see at the Exodus. And then we have Abram gaining many possessions throughout this event. He ends up coming out and leaving with more than he came in with. And this is all the elements of the Exodus story. The people of Israel are referred to throughout the scriptures as the covenantal bride of Yahweh. They're a symbolic bride and wife to God in that covenant sense. Pharaoh takes the bride that is not his at the Exodus story, uses them for his own benefit. Plagues come on Egypt. Pharaoh eventually drives them out forcefully and angrily after his firstborn dies. And then the Israelites end up plundering Egypt on the way out, so that they leave with more than what they came with. And God brings out his people, considering Abram's history with Egypt and the fact that he has an Egyptian servant, Hagar. It makes a lot of sense why we see Egypt oppressing Israel in the Exodus story, based on their relationship history and where they're at. And then, before we close with verse 20, I want to go back and make a few observations and connections to Genesis chapter 3, okay? So think about the components of the Genesis 3 story. We have a man and his wife. Right here we have Abram, and we have his wife Sarah, just like we see in the Genesis 3 story. The woman here is being told something. Just like in Genesis 3, the serpent creeps up to Eve and goes, "Did God really say?" And here we have a woman that's beautiful in appearance. She's attractive. She's desirable. The Egyptians will take her, right? So in the Genesis 3 narrative, we have the forbidden fruit, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? That fruit is attractive, something to be desired, right? And then we have Eve taking and reaching for that fruit. And then we see here Abram is actually motivated to tell Sarah this and to scheme this up. He's motivated by a fear of what might happen. Or in other words, there's something about what could happen or what might happen that motivates Abram to do what he does here. Same with Eve. The serpent gets her when he says, you will be like God. So she's motivated by that. When she sees that, oh, I can know good and evil on my own terms, she takes and eats. And then there's this essence of, look, Abram's afraid that they'll kill him, but they'll let Sarah live. So there's life and death. Just like in Genesis 3, God tells Adam and Eve, look, I've given you life. Don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In that day you'll surely die. So there's a promise of life and this assurance of death if they disobey. And then the Egyptians end up, just like Abram said, if they see you, they're going to want you. Well, when Abram entered, the Egyptians saw the woman was beautiful, just like Eve sees the fruit is desirable and good to eat and good for food and pleasant to the eyes. And when they saw her, they took her into Pharaoh's house, just as Eve took the fruit. And then what's interesting is there is a consequence for Pharaoh taking what isn't his, and it's called the plagues. But here in this situation, Pharaoh isn't to be viewed as the one who's necessarily in the wrong. It's actually Abram. Because you have in Genesis 3, God calls Adam and goes, what have you done? Calls Eve, like, what did the serpent do to you? Tells the serpent, what have you done? That kind of thing. And here, in the place of God, just narratively, Pharaoh is the one going, what have you done to me, Abram? Right? So there's consequences. There's that same kind of calling to hold someone accountable and to give consequences. And the consequence Pharaoh dispenses is that, well, Abram and Sarah are sent out. They're sent away. They're, in that sense, exiled. And after Adam and Eve eat from the tree, where are they sent? They're sent away from the tree of life in exile. And then Pharaoh gave orders to his men saying, look, send them away. But I think the men there are not just to play a role in sending them away, but to ensure they also don't come back in. And at the Genesis 3 story, we have God put cherubim with a flaming sword at the entrance to the garden into the tree of life at the east, so that Adam and Eve don't go back in. They guard the way back in. And I think the men here that Pharaoh orders are to kind of play that role as well, to ensure they don't come back into Egypt. And then, so if we put all this together, what you're going to see, unfortunately, the role that Abram plays in this story, not to negate the fact that God has called him, not to negate the role he's going to play later on, not to negate his righteousness and faith and all that, but to say at this moment in his life, where he's at in his relationship with God, and in this story, he's playing the role of the serpent. He's the one deceiving his wife, involving his wife into deceive the Egyptians and trick Pharaoh, and there's consequences. Not to say that Abram is definitively this evil guy, but in this moment, he's playing the role of the crafty serpent. Verse 20 says, and Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him. They sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Throughout this story, I just have a question. Where the heck is everyone else? Where's Lot? Where's Lot's wife? Where's the household of Abram? Why does it mention the wife and focus on her and Abram only in this story? And I think because we're getting a picture of who Abram and Sarah are at this point, as God is working with them. There's no record of Sarah disagreeing with Abram's plan to deceive Pharaoh. It doesn't mean she didn't, but we don't have that in the story recorded. We don't have Abram considering what might happen to the Egyptians and concerning himself with what if God might get involved and protect them, if God's called us, like maybe God. Abram doesn't consider any of that. He doesn't consider the consequences for his trickery. He was just concerned with himself. And this does not mean that Abram only ever cares about himself and only ever makes mistakes. But the first story, the first chapter that we get of Abram's life is this story about this covenant patriarch fleeing, not trusting God fully, scheming, using others, preserving himself. And I'm sure he had his wife in mind too, but it just seems to be all about Abram in this story. And as God works with him throughout the story, you'll see that Abram changes a lot. he progresses. He definitely gets sanctified in that sense. He becomes more of a faithful covenant partner to the Lord. But God, this is the application. God works with us where we're at. God is in no rush to change us all at once, or he would. He's patient to progressively develop and sanctify us along the way, and even use us with all the flaws we bring to the table. God is sanctifying us progressively in no kind of rush, and this is the love and patience of God, is to know Abram's going to fail and still call him, is to know we're going to make mistakes and still not get it after years and still work with us and use us. So as we close chapter 12, it's ending on a pretty sad note. And yet the promise of God in the middle of this chapter, that I'll multiply you, I'll give you a nation, and at the beginning, that is to be the main focus of this story. Not Abram's failure, not his deception, not him scheming, but the promises of God and the truth and faithfulness of God in the midst of that. So that's all we have for Genesis chapter 12. Next week we'll get to Genesis 13. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Remember when God met Abraham right after Lot separated from Abraham? There's a reason why this story is placed where it is in the biblical narrative, and it's very important. See, many of us have been through a similar difficult situation as Abraham is going through right here in this story. And there's incredible wisdom within this story for us to apply to our own lives as we navigate difficult situations and hard decisions. So let's jump into Genesis chapter 13 to see what's really happening and what wisdom we can apply to our own lives. Genesis 13:1 says, "So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot went with him into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold." And we're wondering, how does Abram get all this silver and gold? We know he was blessed by Pharaoh in the last chapter, but just to summarize this chapter, Abraham leaves Egypt with his family, and he's abundantly blessed by God in material wealth and possessions. Abraham and his nephew Lot, they become too great to dwell together, and Abraham actually lets Lot choose what part of the land he wants to dwell in. Then after Lot leaves, God appears to Abraham in the promised land and promises Abraham the land of the Canaanites, as well as the fact that Abraham will have many descendants. 2 words to capture this chapter would be promised land, promised land. 4 key words to pay attention to would be land, dwell or dwelling, eyes and seeing, and then seed and offspring. Those are 4 words, just variations, a couple variations of each. So back to verse 1, Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negeb. So if you remember what happened in the last chapter, Abraham and his household, they're all sent away from Egypt because of what he did to Pharaoh. So the question becomes, when did Abraham leave Egypt? We know he originally went down to Egypt because of the famine in the land. And so the question becomes, is the famine over now? Or is Abraham going back to the land of the Canaanites, even though there's still a famine, because Pharaoh sent him away and he can't find any safe place in Egypt anymore? Or is God making it clear to Abraham that it was never his intention or his plan for Abraham to go down to Egypt at all? And so we can look at this story from either perspective and say that Abraham was not supposed to go down to Egypt, or he was. But either way, how we discern the leading and the guidance of God in our lives is very, very important. At times, how we discern the guidance of God in hindsight can actually be different than how we understand what he's doing and what we're going through when we're in the midst of it. So we can't say for sure if Abraham was ever supposed to go down to Egypt at all, and if he realized the truth or not once he was sent away from Egypt, if he was like, you know what, I don't think I was supposed to be here. But we can definitely learn from this. And then there's this odd detail about Abraham leaving with his wife, all that he had, and Lot was with him. Now we know throughout the story already that Abraham took Lot from Haran when God sent him away from his family, his father's house, and the land. So the question I have is, why is Lot tagged on in this verse as some extra detail, as if we didn't know Lot was with him? Like we saw in chapter 12, verse 4 and 5, when it says that Lot was brought with Abraham, we have a similar statement here. And I think these details in Scripture that seem extra or unnecessary or repetitive, they're actually very important. They're not just stated randomly without purpose. So pay attention to the fact that Lot went with him into the Negeb and how that's going to affect the rest of this story and the rest of Abraham's life throughout Genesis. Verse 2 says, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And then just a random question I have about this is, why are we told how rich Abram is, specifically in silver and gold and livestock? And this comes right after we're told that Abram and Sarah are sent away from Egypt by Pharaoh. So is this telling us how rich Abram is now because of Pharaoh and because Pharaoh gave him stuff? Or is this how rich Abraham just is, even if Pharaoh didn't give him a bunch of livestock? And then why is this important even to know when he's setting out and leaving Egypt? Why do I need to know that as Abram's leaving back to the land of the Canaanites, he has a lot of stuff? I think this is setting up the story that we're going to see with Lot and Abram being too rich to dwell together, for sure. But we're going to see the people of Israel, they also leave slavery in Egypt with many possessions. God allows them to plunder the Egyptians and get gold and riches on the way out. So where did this silver and gold actually come from, and why do we care that Abram has a lot of it? We aren't told Pharaoh gave him silver and gold in the story, just that he gave him a lot of livestock, which doesn't mean it didn't come from Pharaoh, but we don't have that recorded in Genesis chapter 12. Verse 3, and he journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. And if you remember in chapter 12, Abram set up an altar at two different locations. I forget where. One is with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And then the other is, appeared to Abraham, at the Oak of Moreh. I was reading where we're at in the scriptures. Oak of Moreh, and then between Bethel and Ai. And he's going back to the second place where he built an altar, where his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai. So just seems odd that Abraham is going backwards. Is that just the only place he knows in the land? We were told in chapter 12 that he went to those places specifically because the Canaanites were still in the land, which means they proved to be an issue. And so maybe he found a sense of refuge and security at these locations. But why does Abraham feel the need to go back to a place where God met him in the beginning? Either Abraham is a bit disoriented and looking for a sense of direction and security from God after what transpired with Pharaoh. Maybe Abraham is just checking in with God along the way to know the next step or if he's going the right direction. Or Abraham was told at some point to go back to the place where he met with God, and we don't have that recorded. But either way, this is important for us to recognize that we need to periodically check back in with God on a daily basis, on an hour-to-hour basis, to make sure that God is indeed establishing our steps. We need to seek his face daily. And at times we'll find ourselves even in similar environments and places where God had previously met us because he's bringing us back to that setting or that memory to remind us of what he's done, to remind us of who he is and what he's spoken to us over our life. Verse 4 tells us the place where he went specifically was the place that he had made an altar at the first, which I don't believe is the first place chronologically listed in chapter 12, just saying. This is one of the first places Abraham went to set up shop and build an altar. And there Abraham called upon the name of the Lord, the name of the Lord. So Abraham seems to use, we're not told if he builds a new altar or if he uses the same altar that he built earlier. We just know this is sacred space because of what has happened previously at this location. So why is Abraham calling upon the name of the Lord? What is the purpose behind doing this right after he sent away from Egypt back to the land where there had been a famine and there possibly is still a famine? Why do we have Abram doing this? What is Abraham's emotional state right now? Where is he at mentally? Either way, he responds seemingly to a set of poor circumstances and disorientation by calling upon the Lord. And this has to always be our heart posture. This has to be the way that we handle difficulty and go through hardship or unexpected circumstances, is to call upon the Lord and remain fully dependent on him for everything that we need. That's necessary for us to daily, periodically have a rhythm of calling upon the Lord in all that we do. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. So we're told that Abram has silver and gold and livestock, but Lot, he has a bunch of stuff, not necessarily silver and gold, but animals and herds and tents, people, and so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they couldn't dwell together. So twice we're told in the same verse the issue that the story was building towards is that Abraham and Lot, they can't dwell together in their current state. This is why I think we were told in the beginning Abraham was very rich, because his abundance actually becomes somewhat of a problem when you combine it with Lot's abundance and all the stuff he has. The land simply can't support both of them. This doesn't mean that Abraham's abundance wasn't from God or it wouldn't have caused problems, but sometimes the abundance God brings his people in can actually cause other issues that they didn't anticipate, that God intends to work out and use for good. And it's an opportunity to grow and lean on God rather than the material provision that he's given his people. And I think people have problems with that. Why would God give what he knows might cause other problems in their life, or potentially increase the likelihood of other things happening, or make it a little difficult, or be an obstacle in some sense? And I think just look at the people of Israel. They were blessed with a lot, and that blessing became a snare to them because of the way they handled it, because of the way they framed it up and looked at it. So it's not God's issue, it's our issue, how we handle and utilize and think about what he puts in our hands. And so this is possibly, I know I've said this in previous studies, but I'm not convinced that Abraham was supposed to bring Lot, his nephew, and his household. I think Abraham was supposed to leave everything about his father's household, everything about their land, everything about his father's name and his family, he was supposed to leave behind. And I think what we have in verse 5 and 6 is another indication that Abraham simply wasn't supposed to bring Lot along the way. God called Abram to a land, yet that land wasn't enough for them to both live in close proximity. It seems as though if God wanted Lot to come and be near to Abram, God would have made it enough, but God did not. This is the first time we see the presence of Lot actually become an issue. In the previous story, Abram's wife and her being along for the journey, that proved to be an issue. And now the focus is on Lot coming with Abraham. He specifically is going to cause issues. This is not the only time Abraham will encounter an issue because he brought Lot, his nephew, because we'll see him have to rescue him from the kings that took him away, and then he'll have to go and pray for Lot to be rescued and pulled out of Sodom and Gomorrah. So this doesn't mean that Lot wasn't supposed to be brought along definitively, like just because we have verse 5 and 6 and they have issues. But when you take this story and then add it with the evidence we already have throughout the rest of the story, all of this seems to indicate, when you put it all together, Lot wasn't originally supposed to be brought along. And for some reason, this just reminds me of when Jesus provided a miracle catch of fish for Peter and the other fishermen. So think about the abundance of Abraham and how rich he is and all the stuff he has. When Jesus calls the disciples to, cast the net over the right side of the boat and you'll get a bunch of fish, it was so much that the nets began to tear. And so the abundance of God was too much for the net to contain. It was breaking out of it, just as the abundance of God for Abraham and Lot was too much for the land to contain. And I don't know if there's any connection between the two stories beyond that, but there are times when abundance does prove to create other issues in life, which God actually intends to bring about sanctification. It's not sinful, it's not morally evil, it's just extra heightened difficulty. And if we think God will spare us from difficulty and hardship and the hard roads, you're sorely mistaken. And so sometimes other issues appear because of the abundance or because of prayers that have been answered that caused other things to happen in our lives. As we try and make room for what God has provided and given us, sometimes what God provides results in a need to expand our own capacity, or for God to expand our capacity. And Abraham is about to demonstrate what it means to make room for others, even in the midst of abundance. Verse 7 says, "And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land." So there's a couple random details that are related to the fact that Abram and Lot cannot dwell in the same place together because of how much stuff they have. And the strife seems to be between their herdsmen and shepherds. So the abundance and the greatness of both families causes problems, like strife, division, and the inability to dwell together in close proximity. And again, this doesn't mean that the abundance and provision wasn't from God. Some people believe if it's from God, it won't cause problems, but that simply isn't true. When God moves and brings abundance, it can come with extra difficulty to manage and take a lot more, effort to actually contain and make sure we don't, get ruined by it. And it can come with more struggles, as you might need to move other things in your life that are in the way of what God has brought about. And this doesn't mean that God's provision will cause strife and division, but the potential for these things does increase when we do have more. And so humans have a tendency of worshiping and idolizing what God provides rather than worshiping God himself. And we'll see right here that Abraham, he's actually going to do the opposite. He's going to make room for Lot, and he's going to prefer Lot over himself and his stuff. And then there's this random detail at the end that says, at that time the Canaanites and Perizzites were dwelling in the land. And the last time we were told that passing statement about them dwelling in the land was in chapter 12, verse 6, which seems to be the reason Abraham goes to the place at Shechem, the oak of Moreh, to build an altar to the Lord. So why are we told this random detail now? Is it related to the strife between their herdsmen? Is the fact that the Canaanites and Perizzites dwell in the land and there's danger and there's threats, is that possibly playing into the strife that Abraham and Lot's shepherds are experiencing, or their herdsmen? Then Abram said to Lot, hey, this is Abram the problem solver, right? He's making moves. Abraham said, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen. We're kinsmen. Isn't the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I'll go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, I'll go to the left. I love that. Abraham plays the role of mediator and peacemaker here. He doesn't send Lot back home to the land of their fathers and be like, it caused a lot of problems. Just go back home to Pops. Well, he's dead, and your dad's dead. Go back home to your uncle, your other uncle. He'll take care of you. He'll deal with your nonsense. He actually makes room for Lot to live in the promised land too. Even actually giving Lot the first choice to have whatever land he wants. See, Abraham is a man who doesn't just fail in chapter 12, but you'll see him go up and down. He's a perfect picture of the human experience. There's good to humanity, and then there's the not so good. And Abraham is a picture of both. This is a man who right now is mediating and bringing peace between his family and doesn't want to cause strife. So we need to learn how to be people that make peace. And then verse 9, he lets Lot have the best choice. If Abraham is the chosen partner that God has called and the one that God has chosen to work with, why does Abraham give Lot first choice? If I were Abraham, I would have been like, Lot, listen, you're just here along for the ride. You're not the main character. I am, buddy. And yet Abraham doesn't act like that. He gives him a higher position, gives Lot preference. Abraham has decided to go the opposite direction of whatever choice Lot makes. In other words, he's leaving it completely up to Lot to not only decide where Lot's going to live, but also to partially decide where Abraham's going to live. And I love that Abraham seems to trust God enough. He goes, look, God, I trust you to work out whatever happens with Lot's decision. Abraham doesn't have a fear of lack or missing out. He has a trust in God. And when we trust God, we can live in such a way where we give preference to others because we know we're taken care of by God. We know he has our back. In verse 10, it says, and Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley. Right? If you're familiar with the biblical story, this place has, at times, incredible significance. So he sees the Jordan Valley as well watered. It's abundant, flourishing everywhere, like the garden of the Lord. That's a reference to the Garden of Eden, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. And this was before the Lord actually destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So looking at verse 10, is this the biblical author's commentary on how Lot likely looked at the land he saw? Is the biblical author going, the land Lot saw was like the Garden of Eden or like Egypt? Or is Lot actually, in his mind, comparing the land he sees, this is like the garden, this is like Egypt? And if so, how did Lot have a concept and even I guess some visual concept for what the Garden of Eden was? How did he know what that looked like and was? Was that passed down? Was this a commonly known thing? Same with Egypt. No matter what, the question is, why is the comparison made to the Garden of Eden, the Garden of the Lord? Why is, I guess, what is the purpose, rather, of bringing in that location into the story as a reference point for what Lot is seeing? And when I see something like this, where I see, I guess, another link to another story or location throughout the Bible, I want to go pause. Are there any other connections between what I'm seeing here? Like if he's using the Garden of Eden as a reference point for what Lot sees, are there any other connections between the story of the Garden of Eden and the story of what's happening right here? Also, the land of Egypt is compared to the region Lot sees. And why is that? Is there also another purpose in using Egypt as a reference point besides just demonstrating how well watered the land is? The two locations compared to the Jordan Valley are Eden and Egypt. So if we think about that, Abraham was just kicked out of Egypt. In Genesis 3, Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, exiled from the tree of life specifically. And Egypt will play a significant role later on in Israel's history, where they're coming out. And God will warn his people over and over, don't go back to Egypt. And then the rest of God's story is about bringing humanity back to the Garden of Eden, into the presence of God, getting back to the garden presence. And so Egypt and Eden will play opposite roles in the story. They will be counterparts. We want to leave Egypt and get back to Eden. And so I just want to think about that possibly as I'm reading about the land Lot sees. And the fact that Sodom and Gomorrah are referenced tells us that from the perspective of the author, he says they've already been destroyed. It says this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, which means from the perspective of the author, they've already been destroyed. This tells us that the land won't always be lush, it won't always be fruitful, but it will eventually become a barren wasteland, just as Egypt will become a kind of wasteland when the plagues come upon it during the time of Moses. And similar to how God will curse the land in the garden when Adam and Eve sin, he curses the land. Thorns and thistles will it produce. So something to think about. Also, why is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah even referenced here? That passing statement didn't have to be made. Could easily have said, well, we know based on the rest of the story it will be destroyed. You don't have a lot of these statements throughout the biblical narrative. Like these kind of statements are special, where the author, looking in hindsight or standing outside of the story, will record data that is, from the vantage point of the story, it's in the future. So why is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah referenced? That story's coming later on in Genesis. So why jump ahead to tell us what's going to happen? Why shortcut and tell us about the land Lot is choosing? It's almost like letting us know the land Lot is choosing is going to be destroyed, and he didn't make a good choice. Are we supposed to see Lot making a poor choice that seems very good on the surface level, and it seems good in his eyes, and it seems good from a worldly perspective, but God actually truly saw what it would be? A land that's full of wickedness and sin. Eve, if we think about the connection between the Garden of Eden and the land Lot sees and will dwell in, Eve in Genesis 3 in the garden will also lift up her eyes to see the forbidden fruit. And she'll qualify it differently and see it differently than God sees it. So maybe that is a connection the author is making between this story and the Eden story, is that Lot lifts up his eyes and he saw, kind of like Eve evaluated from a human worldly perspective, the forbidden fruit, and both go after what appears good in their own eyes, but in the end, it's not a good choice. And the consequences of both their choices catch up to them. And then here's the wisdom for us. We have to learn how to make decisions by God's standards and by his word and with his perspective and with his spirit leading us. Otherwise, we get into some big trouble when we evaluate things and make decisions entirely off of human wisdom and our own fleshly perspective. Verse 11, and we'll be done here. Lot chose for himself. I think that is very important. We're given an image of Lot where he's choosing for him, and I'll comment on that in a second. He chooses the Jordan Valley because it looks good in his own eyes. It's good for him. It'll benefit him, and he journeys east. If you're familiar with the story so far, east is a theme. Thus, they separated from each other. So again, Lot chooses what looked best to him, what would be most beneficial for him. Abraham, on the other hand, lets the choice go to another. He's not in it for himself. He's not self-centered and all about his own self-interest. He lets Lot choose first and will take whatever's left over. And Lot is just the nephew that got brought along. Yet Abraham truly seeks for the ultimate good of his nephew here, to preserve that family bond and unity and concern himself with Lot's good and profiting, while Lot just seems to run for whatever is good for him and looks good. And we're presented two very different characters here. Lot chooses the land in the east direction of the promised land, whereas the people come from the east in chapter 11 of Genesis. They come from the east to build the Tower of Babel. Adam and Eve are exiled seemingly east of the tree and the garden after they make the wrong choice to rebel against God and do what's right in their own eyes. Cain is exiled to the east, and now we have Lot going east. The narrative so far matches up pretty neatly with the Genesis 3 story if we're looking at what Lot is doing and the end of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Lot and Abraham separating from each other reminds me of the people being dispersed 2 chapters ago with the Tower of Babel story. The people are dispersed across the earth after God confuses their language and in the plains of Shinar and separates them. They disperse because of misunderstanding and confusion, while Lot and Abraham here separate because the land can't sustain both of them so close to each other. So it's not a misunderstanding and being confused, it's in agreement to do what's right for both of them. So as we're going to see throughout the rest of the story, things won't go particularly well for Lot once he separates from Abraham. It's almost as if the narrative is letting us know that Lot's success, Lot's blessing, Lot's favor is because of his connection to Abraham, his proximity to Abraham, the fact that he's attached to Abraham, God's chosen partner and vessel to work within the earth. So that will also be something we'll revisit throughout the rest of the story. That is all I got for you guys in this section of Genesis chapter 13. We will pick it up in verse 12 in the next Bible study walkthrough. I'll see you guys there. Remember when Lot separated from Abraham in Genesis 13? There's a reason why this story is incredibly significant. See, many of us have been through what Abraham is experiencing here in this story, and there's incredible wisdom for us to navigate our own fears, insecurities, and past hurts. Let's jump into Genesis chapter 13 to see what's really happening in this story and what wisdom God has to offer us. Genesis 13, starting in verse 11, it says, "So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other." And in the last Bible study walkthrough, we broke down the east and why I think Lot choosing this specific region and why it's compared to Egypt and the Garden of Eden, why all of that is significant to what's happening in the Abraham story. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. So in chapter 13, to summarize, Abraham leaves Egypt after Pharaoh sends him and his household away. Abram is abundantly blessed by God in material wealth and possessions. Abraham and Lot, his nephew, they become too great to dwell together in the same land. The land can't support them. And so Lot ends up leaving, and Abraham allows Lot to choose whatever land Lot wants to dwell in. Then God appears to Abraham to give him a promise, or to rather reaffirm the promises he's already given Abraham about descendants and land and a future. And then throughout this chapter, you'll see 4, words that are very important, that being land, dwelling, eyes or seeing, and then seed and offspring. So looking at verse 12 and 13, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. So here we have Lot going towards Sodom or Sodom. We know what's going to happen in that region in a couple chapters, where God will bring judgment upon that region for the outcry that comes against it. Verse 13, "Now the men of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord." Lot moves among sinners in a valley region that seems to be on the outskirts of the land of Canaan, the land of promise, while Abraham stays in the land of promise, even though it might have looked better in other regions, right, to just his physical eyes. And so Abraham is still surrounded by Canaanites, so there's danger and sin and wickedness around him, just as with Lot. But Lot ends up in a place that seems to be even more wicked than where Abraham is, because of how God deals so swiftly with Sodom and Gomorrah. And God told Abraham this would be the land he would give him. He already did that in chapter 12 and said, "This is the land I'm going to give you and your descendants." So Abraham seems to be settling and staying in faith. And sometimes faith is moving. Sometimes faith is making decisions to propel us forward towards the vision God has given us. Other times, faith is actually staying still and trusting God to move us at his pace at the right time. And we need to learn how to discern between the two. When am I supposed to do something that moves my life forward? And when am I supposed to stay where I am, trusting that God is going to move me forward at his pace and put things into position? And that requires discernment and prayerful navigation. Also, Lot doesn't know he doesn't seem to know that he's moving among some of the most wicked sinners of that time. But God still has a plan for Lot. The question becomes, is this what God wanted for Lot? And we can't say either for sure yes or for sure no. God could have wanted to use Lot to minister and be a kind of representative and ambassador to the people there of God. Or God could have wanted Lot to avoid the whole thing, and Lot just made a dumb decision. We can say for sure, though, that God intends to pull him out eventually and bring destruction on those cities. But does that mean that Lot had no purpose being there at all originally? Or has Lot's role come to an end by the time that God visits him in that region? And so just some applications. Sometimes we look back in hindsight at where we were and what we were going through, and we wonder, were we supposed to be there at all? Was that God's plan for us at all? And while we can't always say for sure, we can trust that God will bring about his purposes, even through our own lack of discernment at times and failure to recognize his voice, and even through our own silly decisions. God's sovereign plan will even include the decisions we make that are contrary to what he wants, which is not an excuse to sin at all or to just ignore his voice. But we can lean on the grace of God, even when we look back in hindsight and go, I'm not sure if I was supposed to be there. Verse 14 says, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him. In other words, what God is about to do is come to Abram and reaffirm the promises. The question becomes, was God wanting to wait for Lot to leave? Because no matter what the Lord says to Abraham here, what he does after Lot separates from Abram, that doesn't definitively mean that God was waiting for Lot to leave. Maybe if Lot stayed, he would have been a part of this. But if you read throughout the story of Abraham and Lot, the specific promises for a future, for land, for descendants, for, a kingdom, these promises that God gives individually to Abram in personal visitations, we don't see Lot have that. And so it seems likely, based on the narrative, that God actually did wait for Lot to leave and separate and make his decision before he comes and brings these promises to Abram, or reaffirms the promises to Abram. Kind of like when, I guess, Jacob is left alone. But God says to Abram, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are. Northward, westward, for all the land you see, I will give to you. Now, that wouldn't be a promise for Lot, so it makes sense that Lot would have had to be out of the picture for Abram to receive these promises, though we see in chapter 12, Lot is around. Lot is with Abram when Abram builds an altar between Bethel and Ai, and then at the oak of Moreh, he builds altars to God, and God visits him and promises him these things, and Lot might be present. So there are just a lot of things to consider. But sometimes God does wait for certain things to play out before he comes and brings a word. So he says, lift up your eyes and look northward, southward, eastward, westward, everywhere. All the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. And if you consider the story that took place two chapters ago with the plain of Shinar and the Tower of Babel and the people that come from the east, God disperses them in every direction. And so this might be somewhat of a connection to that story as well, where they're dispersed across the land. And God is saying, hey, Abram, your offspring are going to expand in every direction. And I don't believe he's just referring to the land of the Canaanites, because eventually the promised seed of the Messiah is going to be a blessing to the nations, which are going to be in every direction of the world. He says, for all the land that you see, I'm going to give to you and to your offspring forever. So, just again to revisit the idea that God waits till Lot separates from Abram. Why does God wait till Lot leaves? To tell Abram that all the land you see in every direction is going to be yours, Abram, and your descendants. God could have told Abraham this sooner, but he chose to wait. Like when God met Jacob on his way to meet Esau, God waited until Jacob was alone to really get with him in a personal visitation and wrestle him. And sometimes that's what God does. He waits for us to be alone, to get us a timely message. And God knows when and how we need his messages delivered to us. But the question becomes, are we open and receptive to his voice? Are we setting aside times and rhythms in our life to be alone with God to even hear his voice? Because God tells Abram, lift up your eyes. And if you look at what Lot does, Lot ends up lifting his eyes in verse 10, and he saw the Jordan Valley. Lot chose what seemed to be the better choice. And it's as if God seems to be reassuring Abram. Maybe this is reading a lot into the text, but I don't believe so. I think based on, he tells Abram, lift up your eyes and look. And then we saw Lot lifting up his eyes and choosing for himself. It's as if God is reassuring Abram, you didn't miss out. God has something good in store for Abram and his descendants, even though what appeared to be the better land was taken by Lot, and Lot has left now. It seems as though God is comforting and encouraging Abraham that he did the right thing by letting Lot go, and letting Lot choose first and choose the better land, even though it seemed to leave Abram with the leftovers, you might say. That doesn't mean the land Abraham is looking at is bad, but compared to what Lot chose for himself, it looked good, though God saw what it truly was, a land full of sinners that had judgment coming, and it was spiritually barren and a wasteland in that sense. So the leftovers in this situation are exactly what God chooses to work with and use for Abraham's good and his descendants. And this is true in our own lives. Often we get fear of missing out. We get FOMO. We have a sense of, did I really miss out on the better option for me and my family and my future? And we get fear that we missed out by giving preference to other people or sacrificing ourselves for another's good. But God will meet us in those times. And I believe he does comfort us and reassure us that he has good things in store for us. And there is enough for everyone when it's all said and done if we just trust God and do what he calls us to. Someone else's gain doesn't have to mean my loss. If we learn to trust God and rest in his will and his ways and his character, we don't need to hold on so tightly to whatever we have, but we'll be able to give freely like Abraham does in this chapter. And God says to Abram, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are currently. From the place where you are currently. Abraham is in the hill country between Bethel and Ai, where he built an altar to the Lord in chapter 12. And so usually sacred spaces are going to be high places, or under trees, or some kind of lush, abundant, flourishing, fruitful place. So it's likely that Abraham might be on a kind of mountain or high place that would allow him to really survey the land for a long distance. And God wants to show Abram that what he's really going to receive, his descendants are going to receive, is beyond his comprehension. But he's giving him a visual of that. This land is going to be theirs forever, even though Abraham won't be alive to, I guess, technically possess it for himself. His descendants will. And I think there will be times throughout our lives where what we see with Abraham will actually happen for us. Not to insert ourselves too much in the story, but I see this throughout the biblical narrative and throughout my own life. That there are times where God gives us insight or vision into the future he's prepared for us, not just in terms of new creation and the new heavens, but also in this world and in this life. And these moments where God gives us insight into what he has, they fuel us to keep us going and give us fresh perspective and remind us that God has promised us good things. And even though things might not look like what he said and don't match up with the vision God's given us, God often fuels his people with his word and with his promises and with fresh reminders and vision of what God has in store for his people. Not just generally for all the people of God, resurrection and glorification, but also individually for the role that we play in the body in this world for now and the purpose God has for us and the calling God has for us. So, why does God take this opportunity to tell Abraham what he's technically already told Abraham in chapter 12, verse 6? This is a repeat of the promises. Why repeat what Abraham already knows? He knows he's going to get the land. He knows he's going to get descendants. This time, though, it's different. And God wants to show Abram all the land he intends to give him and his offspring. Whereas in chapter 12, God didn't give Abram this grand picture. Look at all the land, east, west, south, north. It was just like, this land you're in, I'm going to give it to you. Here it seems to be a kind of progression from that. And this, for some reason, this reminds me of when Satan's tempting Jesus in the wilderness, and Satan shows him all the kingdoms of the world, right? And he says, if you bow down to me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. And yet Jesus knows he rightfully already owns all creation. But as the perfect resurrected human, he intends to acquire those kingdoms on behalf of his people through his death, resurrection, and ascension. So while Jesus technically owns all things and is the heir of all things, he's going to acquire what we lack on our behalf through his death and resurrection and ascension. But Satan wants Jesus to shortcut. He wants to give Jesus what God has already promised his son, which is going to come through his son's obedience. Abraham here is promised land, not by effort, not by reward, not by merit, but simply by grace. And anything good worth having is given by God as a gift of grace. All good things come from the Father of lights. Even though he'll let us play a role at times and we have a responsibility and he'll use our lives to produce good things for us and for others, ultimately all good comes from God as the source. Verse 16, he says, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth. Now, if the context and the framework for this visitation is that God is reassuring and comforting and encouraging Abraham, it's fascinating to me that offspring being multiplied and offspring coming at all into the picture is part of God's, speech to Abraham here. So that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Look, arise and walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. Now, what's interesting is God is going to take Abraham, essentially from this point moving forward, he's taken him on a tour of the land that he's going to give his descendants. And I just want to know why. Why does God have Abram walk the land? Why does he need to see the land? Why does that have to happen? Or why does God include that in the plan for Abraham? I want Abraham not just to see it, but to experience it, to walk it in faith. Real quick, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you at abovereproachministry.com. Go to the website or click the links in the description below to check out all of our free Bible study resources. We have online Bible classes, devotional studies, Bible study workshops, all of my sermon notes, and more. You can even join our online church community on the Discord app. We also have discussion groups all around the world, and if you don't see one in your area, message me and we'll help you start a launch group. I personally lead a group in Spartanburg, South Carolina. If you live in the area, we'd love to have you join us on Fridays for Bible study. So contact me if you're interested, and if you or your church would like me to come preach or teach, just message me or shoot me an email and we'll see what we can do, because I love preaching in person. If you're a new follower of Jesus, click the New Believers section to access everything we recommend for new believers. And be sure to snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, to support this ministry. All right, that's all I got for you. Let's jump back into the video. I understand why God promises Abraham land. Right when Lot leaves, Lot has chosen what appears to be the better portion, even though we know that's not necessarily the case. So this story in context is all about land and inhabiting and dwelling places, but God seems to mention the descendants and the offspring here alongside the land, which we've seen over and over throughout the Abraham story, is that land and offspring and future and blessing, they all come together, and a name, a blessing to the nations. All these ideas come together. So when I look at this in context here, this seems like an unnecessary promise to give in this setting and in this context. It seems irrelevant. So the tension in the story involves land, not necessarily having descendants. But if we think about who just left, Abraham's nephew just left. Lot's parents aren't alive. We had in Genesis chapter 12, Lot's father died, and then his grandfather, Abraham's father, died. So their only living relative for now is Abraham's brother Nahor. So you have Abraham, Nahor, and then Lot, who continues his father's line. Abraham is old. Sarah is barren and old. They're up there in years. Having children is an impossible feat physically and just practically. It's not possible. And Abraham knows all this information. And yet, God told Abraham he's going to have descendants. Abraham knows he and his wife can't physically produce offspring. It's not possible from his standpoint. And yet, this is a reminder that God knows what people need to hear when they need to hear it. So I just want to be thinking about why this comes into play, but a quick application. It might seem random, irrelevant, and even unnecessary at times what God speaks to us and what God confirms for us. But even if it's unrelated to our current life and circumstances, we can trust that God's word is always timely and exactly what we need. So I've already hinted at in previous Bible study walkthroughs that I am of the perspective that Abraham took Lot with him as the way, as technically seeing Lot as the way God will fulfill his promises. In other words, Abraham might view Lot, and I understand different culture for us, so there's that cultural gap and differences in how we view family, but Abraham might have viewed Lot as the way that God would continue Abraham's line and lineage, is Lot would kind of be a surrogate. So the question I have is, did Abraham possibly bring Lot because he supposed that God might give him descendants through Lot as a kind of surrogate for him. Was Lot the one that Abraham supposed would continue his family name and somehow being his closest living family relative who's with him? Nahor's gone. He's in Ur of the Chaldeans. Is technically Abraham viewing Lot in that way. Again, the reason I say this is because we've been told several times specifically that Abram brought Lot with him. And when God said to leave his family and his father's house and his land, now Lot has left. He's gone. He's moved on. He's found a place to live and build a family. And God seems to step in once that happens and reassure Abraham once again, you are going to have descendants. Lot leaving doesn't change that. So this kind of comforting promise for me when I read this in context, it only makes sense within the context of disappointment and doubt and Abraham having given up something. It makes the most sense that God reassured Abraham about descendants because Abraham just surrendered what he thought would be the vehicle of God's promise, that being Lot. And I think this makes sense in context. Looking at Abraham's life, he's going to view Hagar, his Egyptian servant, in this same way. Abraham and Sarah go, well, God promised us descendants. He must have meant Hagar. In other words, this wouldn't be out of left field. This wouldn't be inconsistent with Abraham's character and decisions throughout the story. Abraham viewing Lot as the way God would fulfill his promises, that's not too far, out of left field. That actually makes sense. He has a history of making decisions like that. So what we'll see later on is that once Lot leaves, Abraham's going to have to rescue Lot, and then he'll have to let him go again. Then he'll have to step in and play mediator role and pray for Lot once God, says judgment's coming for Sodom and Gomorrah. So what we see here is that Abraham chooses to do what was right, but it comes at a cost to himself. It was a kind of sacrifice to not bring Lot with him anymore and not have that security and assurance and well, at least we have Lot. God's probably going to use Lot. By letting him go, Abraham was essentially saying, I have stripped myself of any worldly, physical, human plan or strategy or scheme to bring about my own descendants. I'm free falling into the hands of God. I have no backup plan. There's no physical way this should happen. Abraham will have to make another similar sacrifice in Genesis 22 with Isaac. And throughout our lives, we will have to let go of what we once found hope and security in too. In order to truly rely on God and what He has for us, we will have to let go of things. There will be self-denial. There will be surrendering. There will be yielding and giving up what we thought would be most beneficial to us, but God says something else is better. Following God often involves that difficult sacrifice, but He's worth it. So did Abraham possibly bring Lot to be the one who would realize the promise and secure that? I tend to think so. And then God has Abraham walk through the land. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre. And this is the first time we see this location, which is going to be a key, spiritually significant location throughout the biblical story. Specifically with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this location, the oaks of Mamre, are going to be a place where they set up house, at least Abram here, and frequently visit, which was at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. How does Abraham respond to the promises and the presence and the visitation of God? With worship. So notice that God is the one giving the land. God is the one giving descendants. God is the one giving success and multiplication and expansion. Abraham is slowly realizing he's not going to accomplish what God has promised him in his own efforts. Abraham is slowly realizing he cannot plan or scheme his way into the promises of God being realized for him. Though we'll see hints of that coming back up with Hagar, and we're like, bro, Abraham, I thought you learned. God is giving Abraham what He's promised. It's not coming by way of human work and effort and scheming. It's coming by way of promise. God said He'll do it, so He's going to do it. This is not about what Abraham can do, but about what God can do. It's not about what Abraham can give, but about what God gives. And we'll see that in Genesis 22. It's not about what Abraham sacrifices to God. It's about what God provides on that mountain, on Mount Moriah. This is the mount that God provides. The Lord will provide. It's not about what Abraham can accomplish. Abraham's job is to see and believe, which is the gospel. The gospel's all over that. We see what God promises to give. We see what God has provided in his Son, we take him at his word, and we trust, and we receive. And that's the story of every biblical character. They're called to believe, trust, rely on God and his word and his promises, and receive what God has done and what he's provided. And so we'll see that the oaks of Mamre at Hebron going to be a significant location throughout the rest of the story. But how do we handle fear and the illusion of control and this tension of I'm supposed to do something, but I also have to rely on God, and sometimes I'm supposed to take a decision into my own hand while prayerfully navigating that, and other times God says sit and be still and do nothing. How do I navigate this? I think this story just really provides a lot of wisdom for us to employ when we're in similar situations that Abraham finds himself in, at least in this chapter. So that is Genesis 13. We'll pick it up in Genesis 14 next week. I hope this was a blessing to you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to share your thoughts and your insights in the comments. If you want to share your thoughts and questions about these studies, join us every Thursday evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a live discussion together. And thank you for supporting this ministry. Your support helps us accomplish our mission, which is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. We're only able to make all of these free resources because of generous supporters like you. So thank you very much for all of your support. Make sure to visit abovereproachministry.com to check out all of our free resources. And as always, keep moving towards Jesus.